She was invisible for 18 months, until one day, she chose not to be. Claire Bennett used to be a rising star in the finance world, confident, respected, and in control. But when her mother was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, Claire gave it all up for a quieter job, just to make sure there was insurance. She became a secretary efficient, reliable, and unseen. Her boss, Graham Whitaker, a brilliant but arrogant CEO, never once asked who she really was, until the day Claire realized a mistake in a multi-million-dollar proposal that no one else had noticed. She stood before a room full of powerful men, risking her job and perhaps her dignity to tell the truth. If you had to choose between your silence and your worth, what would you choose? This is not a story about romance. It's a story about courage, about being seen not for your title, but for your truth. Stay with us, because sometimes the quietest people have the most powerful stories. If this touches something in you, leave a comment. Your story matters too. Now, let's begin. Claire Bennett walked into the office every morning at 7:00 a.m. Sharp early enough to be reliable, quiet enough to be invisible. The old brass elevator let out its usual sigh as it arrived on the 5th floor of the historic Whitaker and Row building. The scent of polished wood and stale coffee lingered faintly in the corridor, mixing with the crisp October air that clung to her wool coat. Claire stepped out, heels tapping softly against the marble tile, her right hand already reaching into her tote for the key card she never forgot. She didn't need to look up. She could walk the path to her desk with her eyes closed. And yet, no one ever really looked back. The lights in the reception area were still warming up, glowing dim amber as if waking from sleep. Karen, the front desk assistant, offered a polite nod as Claire passed, fingers flying over the keyboard, not pausing long enough to exchange more than a glance. The cleaning crew had already disappeared, and the office was momentarily hushed, a rare kind of stillness that Claire secretly cherished. She took off her coat, hung it neatly on the stand beside her desk, and began her ritual: boot up the computer, refill the copy paper, check the supply tray, and finally brew the coffee. Graham's coffee, black, extra hot, 1 sugar cube, stirred precisely 5 times. She never forgot. By 7:15, everything was in place. His briefing folder sat centered on his desk, the blinds in his corner office tilted just so, and his screensaver had been turned off to the desktop he liked clean and quiet. Claire sat back at her desk, glancing once at the digital clock on the wall. 7:29. Like clockwork. The elevator chimed. Graham Whitaker entered the office as he always did, coat draped over one arm, phone in the other, eyes locked to the screen. He walked past her without breaking stride, only murmuring a distracted "morning" as his hand reached instinctively toward the coffee she held out for him. He didn't look up. He never did. Claire returned to her desk, her face expressionless but not cold. She'd long since stopped expecting more than these daily exchanges. Not because she didn't deserve more, she did, but because this place, this version of her life, demanded less. The rest of the office began to stir around 8:00. Footsteps echoed off the high ceilings. Doors opened and closed. Laughter flared in brief bursts from the break room. Claire greeted everyone with a nod, sometimes a smile. Most responded in kind. Few used her name. She was Graham's secretary, sometimes the front desk girl, or her, depending on the department. No one was unkind, just unaware. She blended in, like the office plants someone remembered to water, but never noticed growing. And yet, beneath the polished surface of routine, something stirred quietly inside her. A knowing, a restlessness, a gentle ache that hadn't quite become pain, not yet. Because once, Claire Bennett had not been invisible. Once, she had stood at podiums in conference rooms that overlooked the Manhattan skyline. She had run numbers in her head, faster than some could input them into spreadsheets. She'd advised senior partners on mergers, drafted financial strategies for $250 million portfolios, and worn heels that clicked not in submission, but in confidence. That was before her mother's diagnosis, before the late-night ER visits and the early signs of confusion that turned into whole days of forgetfulness, before the unpaid leave and the resignation, and the long, quiet months of watching the savings account shrink like leaves in November. The job at Whitaker & Rowe had not been part of a grand plan. It had been a compromise, one that offered decent health insurance and a predictable schedule. It let her be there for her mother and still pay the bills. It required her to be small, but it didn't ask for more than she could give, at least not out loud. Outside the window, the sky had taken on that particular shade of gray-blue unique to late October in Chicago. Trees along the street below were thinning, most leaves gone, some holding on in burnt orange defiance. The wind, cold and dry, whispered against the glass like a warning. Claire wrapped her cardigan a little tighter around her. Her inbox pinged softly. She glanced at the screen. Subject: City Council Presentation. Nov. 10. From Rachel Legal. She clicked a short message. Graham would be presenting the firm's redevelopment proposal to the City Council. $180 million in public-private funding on the line, 2 weeks from now. She was expected to prepare briefing materials and coordinate logistics for the pitch. Claire stared at the screen. It should have been routine, just another item on the task list. But something about it made her pause. A small weight settled in her chest. Like when you step into a room and can't name what feels off, only that something is. She minimized the window and leaned back, the hum of the overhead light suddenly too loud. Her hands rested in her lap, still. And then the question came, quiet but steady. How long until they forget who I used to be? If I let them? The office buzzed around her, unaware. Outside, the wind picked up. There was a time when Claire Bennett didn't wait for instructions she gave them, not in a loud, commanding voice. Claire never needed volume to make herself heard. What she had was clarity, and people listened. In her former life, she wore tailored blazers, spoke confidently in boardrooms, and her name meant something beyond the title next to it. She had been Director of Strategic Planning at Lakeview Financial, one of the largest regional banks in the Midwest. Her office had a view of the Chicago River, and her work shaped the bank's investment directions, risk protocols, and merger strategy. Her emails sparked department meetings. Her voice could tilt decisions. And then the phone rang on a Thursday morning. It wasn't the kind of call that made the world fall apart in an instant. Not at first. Just a note of concern from a neighbor Claire's mother had wandered into the street, confused about where she was. Claire left work early, a mild worry tugging at her thoughts, but she expected it to be nothing. A slip, maybe stress or fatigue, something manageable. It wasn't. The diagnosis came quietly, without fanfare. Early onset Alzheimer's, stage 1. Manageable? Yes, but progressive. Unforgiving. Claire remembered staring at the doctor's lips as he explained treatment paths. Words like cognitive decline and memory impairment blurred into the sterile scent of disinfectant. Her mother sat beside her, calm, like someone watching a weather report for another state. She had smiled gently, as if to say, "Don't worry, darling, I'm still here." But Claire knew better. She was losing her mother in increments. At first, she tried to balance both lives, work and care, meetings in the morning, doctor's appointments in the afternoon. She set reminders on her phone, hired a part-time nurse, adjusted her hours. But the decline was relentless. There were burned pots in the kitchen, forgotten names, mail left in the oven. Her mother began calling her Susan, Claire's long-departed aunt, and asking when Claire, her daughter, would be coming home from college. 6 months later, she handed in her resignation. No fanfare, no farewell party, just a quiet email and a final walk out of the glass doors she once walked through with pride. She spent the next year as a full-time caregiver. It was noble work, but isolating. There were good days. There were also days when her mother cried for hours, accusing Claire of being a stranger in her own home. Claire read financial journals at night, not for work, but to stay sane. It reminded her of who she used to be. Eventually, the money ran low. The retirement savings she'd intended to build back up had trickled into prescriptions, home modifications, and in-home care. The job search was brutal, too senior for entry-level roles, but out of the game for too long to be seen as viable for leadership. And so, when she saw the listing for a senior administrative assistant, Whitaker and Rowe, architecture and development, she took a breath and clicked apply. She omitted the title director from her resume. She removed the speaking engagements, the consulting credits. She added phrases like team-oriented and detail-focused, terms that said, "I won't threaten your authority." 2 weeks later, she got the call, decent salary, strong benefits, quiet company, safe. Now, every Monday morning, she changed out printer toner, adjusted conference room chairs, restocked the office bathroom supplies, not because she was unqualified for more, but because life had rearranged her priorities. She had made peace with that. Or, so she thought. It was after 5 p.m., one quiet Thursday when it happened. Most of the staff had gone home early, as the weather report warned of high winds sweeping in from Lake Michigan. Claire stayed late to finish preparing the briefing packet for Graham's upcoming site meeting. Graham had left in a hurry that afternoon, distracted as usual, leaving behind a stack of annotated printouts and marked-up architectural drawings. She didn't usually read his notes. It wasn't her place. But something caught her eye as she gathered the papers. A scribbled calculation in the corner of one page. A conversion of load-bearing capacity metrics. It looked off. She frowned, pulling the page closer. Graham had written 3,000 pounds per square inch for a support beam that, according to building code updates from earlier that year, should have been calculated against a higher stress ratio due to material sourcing changes. Claire's background kicked in, uninvited but undeniable. She had handled risk assessments for multi-million-dollar building loans. She knew how small miscalculations could snowball. She flipped through the rest of the packet. Notes on soil displacement, elevation grading, material substitutions. Each note seemed confident, but Claire saw things Graham might not have. Not mistakes, necessarily. Just assumptions that hadn't been rechecked since the latest city updates. She looked at the clock, 4:47 p.m. The cleaning crew was humming in the break room. The floor was mostly dark. Claire stood in the glow of a desk lamp, holding a document that no one had asked her to read, but that now refused to leave her mind. She should have walked away. It wasn't her department, wasn't her problem. And yet, that night, as she lay in bed, her mother already asleep in the next room, Claire stared at the ceiling fan spinning overhead and thought, he doesn't know. He doesn't know I used to do this in my sleep. And he didn't. Graham Whitaker had no idea who she had been. And he'd never asked. The next morning, Claire arrived early as always. The office smelled like burnt toast from the break room and lemon disinfectant from last night's cleaning. She settled in, opened her email, and saw it. Subject urgent city proposal. Update meeting, date, November 10th, 9:00. Vertical bar, location, City Planning Commission. A reminder for Graham's upcoming presentation, the one with $180 million of funding hanging in the balance. Claire looked at the packet again. That one line of conversion sat there, as unchanged as it was wrong. Something pressed at her chest. Not panic, not yet, but weight. Heaviness. She reached for a pen. She didn't need permission to care. She just needed someone to listen. Claire had knocked 3 times. Not literally, but in the quiet ways people like her learn to speak through neatly typed notes, carefully worded emails, and soft suggestions folded into the edges of us busy conversations. And no one opened the door. It started with a quiet afternoon in the back corner of the office, the windows half steamed from an early cold snap. Claire sat with 2 tabs open. One was the official site of the City of Chicago's Planning Department. The other, a PDF dated just 4 weeks ago. Revised Safety and Structural Compliance Addendum, Q4. She'd found it by accident. searching for clarification on a zoning term that Graham had scribbled in the margins of his site proposal. But once she started reading, she couldn't stop. The city had updated its safety requirements, new pressure tolerance benchmarks, revised soil testing thresholds, a reclassification of foundational materials in buildings above 3 stories, all of which applied directly to the firm's proposed project. Graham's proposal was based on the old standards. Claire stared at the screen, her fingers still on the keyboard. She wasn't part of the engineering team. She didn't hold an architect's license. But numbers didn't lie, and what she saw made her heart ache. If this proposal went forward as written, it wouldn't just be disqualified. It would embarrass the firm in front of city leadership. It could cost them future trust and tens of millions in opportunity. She didn't panic. She documented. That same afternoon, she drafted a 1-page summary, concise, factual, neutral in tone. Just the facts, what had changed, where the gaps were, and the pages in the proposal that might be affected. She titled it, Supplemental Update City Compliance Notes, and printed it on crisp white paper. She placed it on Graham's desk. The next morning, it was gone, likely scooped up with the rest of his briefing materials. Claire waited, no comment, no follow-up, no acknowledgement. She sent a polite email just after lunch. Hi, Graham. I left a brief compliance note on your desk yesterday. Let me know if you'd like me to coordinate with legal on the updated benchmarks. She reread it 5 times before clicking. Send. Neutral. Non-confrontational. Helpful. No reply. By Thursday. She tried again, this time in person, as he breezed past her desk between meetings. There were a few city updates I thought might impact the schedules tight. Claire, he said, not slowing, just forward anything to Rachel. He was gone before she could explain that Rachel, brilliant as she was in contracts, didn't usually touch building codes. Claire sat back, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. It wasn't about her pride. It wasn't even about being heard. It was about doing what was right. She had worked too long in risk management to ignore what she knew. The next day, she added a copy of the revised city code to the shared drive. No one noticed. Graham was focused, possibly too focused, on the pitch. He had rehearsed it twice that week in the small conference room, talking through renderings and metrics with the kind of confidence that made people listen before they questioned. But Claire watched him through the glass, her own hands clenched together in her lap. He didn't know. And he didn't know that he didn't know. It was late Friday when she saw him gathering the final version of the proposal into his leather folder. He was humming. That was how sure he was. The meeting with the city council was scheduled for Monday morning, just over 36 hours away. Claire stood near the file cabinet, watching him from the corner of her eye. He double-checked his notes, slipped on his coat, and turned toward the door. He paused long enough to glance at her. Have a good weekend, Claire? You too, she said softly. But he was already gone. The door clicked shut behind him. Silence settled in like dust after movement. She walked slowly back to her desk, but didn't sit. The late October sun had dipped behind the skyline, leaving the office bathed in shadow and amber streetlight. Claire pulled out the printed packet she had made for herself, a copy of the proposal, the updated city regulations, and her own annotations. She placed them gently on her desk and stood staring at them for a long moment. She felt the pressure in her chest, not fear, but the ache of a question she couldn't shake. Do I have the right to say something? Not because she didn't know the answer. She did. But because the world around her, the role she had accepted, the quietness she had worn like armor, had made her believe she needed permission to be more than just the secretary. But in her gut, she knew. This wasn't about titles. It wasn't about stepping out of line. It was about stepping up or watching something unravel that could have been prevented. The clock on the wall ticked past 6:00 p. She reached for her pen. She had watched him walk into dozens of meetings. But this time, she couldn't let him walk alone. It was still dark when Claire arrived at City Hall that Monday morning. The streets of downtown Chicago were slick with overnight rain, and her shoes tapped softly against the wet marble of the building's entrance. She carried a leather folio tucked against her chest, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. Inside, the council chamber buzzed with the quiet tension of an important day. Elected officials moved with practiced poise. Assistants shuffled papers, adjusted microphones, and whispered updates into earbuds. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Everyone, except Claire. She stood for a moment just outside the tall wooden doors, unsure whether to enter as a guest or an observer. Eventually, she slipped into a back row seat, quiet, unannounced, unnoticed, from the front of the room. Graham stood in his signature dark suit, every button in place, his expression focused and confident. He adjusted the projector, glanced at his tablet, and began. "Thank you for the opportunity to present the Whitaker and Rowe proposal for the South Grant Redevelopment Initiative." His voice was steady, familiar. For years, Claire had listened to that voice from the hallway, through closed doors, in passing phone calls. He had a way of sounding like he always knew what came next, even when he didn't. The presentation started smoothly. Floor plans appeared on the screen, projected timelines, cost analyses. A glossy 3D rendering of the proposed cultural center spun gently in digital rotation. But Claire didn't watch the screen. She watched the faces around the room. Halfway through, Councilman Elliott Park raised a hand. His expression was thoughtful, but firm. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "can you confirm that your structural estimates are based on the city's Q4 compliance update issued in September?" Claire felt her breath hitch. Graham blinked. There was the smallest pause, barely a beat, but Claire recognized it. It was the pause of a man who just realized he was 2 steps behind a conversation he thought he was leading. "We've reviewed all relevant guidelines," Graham replied, his tone tight. "Our engineering partners confirmed material compatibility and safety standards," as if he glanced at his notes, August 15th. Councilman Park raised an eyebrow. "Then your team may have missed some recent changes. The September update includes amended load calculations and material sourcing for mid-rise public structures." The air shifted. Claire could see it in the shoulders of the board members, in the subtle tilt of Catherine Rowe's head, in the way Graham's confidence wavered just slightly at the edge of his voice. He looked back at the screen, as if willing the next slide to fix what had just been exposed. Claire's heart pounded. This was the moment. She hadn't planned to speak, hadn't even considered it, not really. But as she looked at the proposal in her hands, and then at the man at the podium, something rose inside her. Not anger, not resentment. Just the quiet, stubborn conviction that if she didn't speak now, everything would unravel. Not just the proposal, but something deeper, something in herself. She stood. The motion was small, but in a room full of seated silence, it was enough to draw every eye. Chairs creaked, heads turned. Even Graham looked up, confusion flickering in his features. Claire stepped forward slowly, her voice soft but clear. "Excuse me, Madam Chair," she said, addressing the board president with a slight nod. "May I speak to that last question?" There was a beat of hesitation, the kind that lives between protocol and curiosity. Then the chairwoman gestured, "Go ahead." Claire took a breath. The city's Q4 update was published on September 3rd. She began. It includes revised structural load benchmarks, changes in material grading for recycled composites, and updated soil compaction thresholds for redeveloped sites. The current presentation reflects standards that are no longer aligned with those requirements. The room went still. Claire didn't look at Graham. She looked at the facts, at the printed regulations she had highlighted in her packet, at the logic she had followed over 3 nights of quiet review. She continued, "I've prepared an alternate analysis using the updated benchmarks. With minimal modifications to foundation planning and load distribution, the proposed structure can meet the city's current code while maintaining architectural integrity." She handed a document to a nearby staffer, who passed it up to the dais. Councilman Park flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. Graham stood frozen at the front of the room. Claire finally glanced his way. He looked at her, really looked as if for the first time he wasn't just seeing a secretary. He was seeing a woman who had stayed late, read everything, and chosen to speak when silence would have been safer. Councilwoman Rowe cleared her throat. "And you are—" Claire's voice was quieter now, but unwavering. "I'm the secretary," she said. Then, after a breath, added, "Or I was—" A murmur rippled through the room. For several seconds, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft shuffle of paper as Park turned another page in her notes. "This is thorough," he said at last. "Very thorough." Claire nodded once. She didn't smile. She wasn't here to impress. She was here to protect something that mattered. Graham finally stepped back from the podium. His eyes hadn't left her. Whatever words had been on his tongue were gone, now replaced by something unspoken. Respect, maybe, or reckoning. The chairwoman tapped her pen against the folder. "I'd like a brief recess to review these materials." Motion granted. Meeting paused. The board members stood and stretched. Staffers gathered coffee. But Claire remained still, her hands now empty, her heart still beating too fast. She wasn't sure what she had just done, but she knew why she had done it. And for the first time in a very long while, she wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time in 18 months, Claire felt the weight of eyes not of scrutiny, but of recognition. She stood by the tall window in the hallway outside the council chamber, her fingers wrapped around a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The room behind her still hummed with quiet conversations, rustling papers, and the occasional click of a laptop closing. But out here, it was quiet, cool, still. She hadn't meant to speak, but she had. And now, everything felt different, not louder, not brighter, just noticed. Like the light had shifted in some small but undeniable way. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Graham didn't walk like a man defeated, but neither did he walk like the man who had entered the meeting 2 hours ago. His pace was slower, shoulders looser. And when he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He just stood beside her, looking out at the gray skyline beyond the glass. Claire didn't turn, neither did he. A long breath passed between them. "Finally," he said. "That was something?" She gave the smallest nod, still facing forward. "I wasn't sure it was my place." Another pause. Then, softer than she expected. "Maybe it always was. I just didn't see it." The admission sat heavy between them, yet strangely light, as if the room itself had been waiting for him to say it. "I'm not angry," he added, as though that were the thing she most feared. Claire turned then, meeting his eyes for the first time since the meeting. "I didn't think you were—" He exhaled through his nose, a short huff that could have been a laugh or a sigh. "I think I've spent too long assuming that silence meant agreement, or indifference." Claire looked down at the cup in her hands. The coffee had gone cold. "It didn't," she said quietly. "It meant survival." That made him glance at her. Really glance, not with impatience or confusion, but with something that felt closer to curiosity or regret. "Can I ask something?" he said, "and I promise it's not an interrogation." She nodded, just once. "Why didn't you ever correct me? Or speak up before today?" Claire stared at the rim of her cup for a long moment before answering. "Because 18 months ago," she began slowly, "my mother forgot who I was." She didn't look at him as she said it. Just let the words sit there, bare and simple. She was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, the kind that moves faster than people expect. And I was still in a position of leadership at my old firm, traveling, pitching, running strategy teams. A pause. I missed 3 appointments because I was on flights to pitch decks that no one even opened. I left her messages she couldn't remember hearing. She finally looked up, so I left. Graham didn't speak. Just listened the way people rarely do when they're used to being the ones talking. I tried for 6 months to find something that paid enough, with health benefits good enough, and hours stable enough so I could be there for her. And then this job opened up. Executive assistant, low profile, consistent, predictable. She gave a small, half-hearted smile, perfect for someone who needed to be invisible. A gust of wind outside rattled the tall window. Neither of them flinched. "I didn't mean to disappear," Claire added, voice thinner now. "I just didn't have space to be seen." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The hallway stretched around them, quiet and gray, and filled with something unspoken. Then Graham cleared his throat. "You know," he said, "in the meeting, when you stood up, I didn't recognize you." She tilted her head. "I was wearing the same clothes I always do." He shook his head. "No, I mean, I finally saw you. Not the woman who manages my calendar or brings coffee in the morning, but the one who reads zoning law for fun, who rewrites risk assessments in the margins of project plans, who saves our reputation without ever raising her voice." Claire swallowed. Something in her chest ached, but it wasn't pain. It was something closer to relief. "I've been wrong," he said quietly. "Not just about the proposal, about what I think leadership looks like." He turned toward her fully now, arms crossed, but not defensive. "Open? I saw you as background, and I was wrong. There it was. Not flattery, not apology dressed up in praise, just the simple truth." She nodded, not out of politeness, but acceptance. The weight between them shifted again, not heavier, just real. Then, Graham added, "Tomorrow morning, I have a follow-up with the council's planning committee. They want a revised version of the proposal, and, well, they want the person who saved it to walk them through it." Claire looked up slowly. "I could handle it alone," he continued, "but I'd rather not. Would you come with me?" Her first instinct was to decline. It rose automatically, a habit formed from too many months of staying small. But then she saw the way he asked, not as a command, as an invitation. Claire hesitated, her breath catching just slightly. Then she nodded, "I will." And in that moment, something opened between them, not just a new dynamic, not just professional respect, but the quiet possibility of something neither of them had yet named. That night, Claire didn't sleep, not from fear, but from possibility. The apartment was silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the soft tapping of her fingers on the keyboard. The city outside her window had long since quieted, lights dimmed, taxis thinned, the pulse of Chicago slowing to a late-night rhythm. But inside, Claire was wide awake. The glow of her laptop illuminated her face, highlighting the gentle creases around her eyes and the focus etched across her brow. The old desk lamp flickered slightly, casting warm light over scattered documents, highlighters, coffee mugs, and folded city zoning codes. It was chaos, but organized chaos, the kind she had once thrived in. She hadn't worked like this in years, not since the long hours building strategies for her former firm, not since late nights fueled by ambition and sharp instincts. But this time, the fuel was different, not ambition, not obligation, purpose. With every line she adjusted, every contingency she outlined, every cost-benefit ratio she refined, she wasn't just preparing a proposal. She was reclaiming the part of herself she'd set aside for far too long. At 3:12 a.m., she took a break, stepping into the kitchen for a fresh cup of coffee. She leaned against the counter, wrapped both hands around the warm mug, and stared out at the sliver of lake visible between buildings. She felt tired, but not worn down. There was something settling in her chest, a calm resolve, as though the pieces of her life were finally beginning to fit again. Imperfectly, perhaps, but honestly, by 5:45, the plan was complete. She had anticipated 5 possible lines of questioning from the city council and drafted responses for each. 3 structural alternatives for budget scenarios, 2 backup suppliers, 1 risk matrix for community pushback. Every slide was clean, deliberate, purposeful, the kind of work that didn't demand applause, only respect. At 6:12 her phone buzzed, a message from Graham. Meet me at 7:15. We need to walk through the updated proposal. Short, direct, but not cold. Claire stared at it for a moment, then typed back a simple, I'll be there. By 7:10, she was outside his office. The building still held its early morning hush, fluorescent lights humming, hallway floors shining from the janitorial shift just finished. The scent of industrial cleaner lingered faintly in the air, mingled with the familiar notes of dark roast coffee brewing somewhere nearby. Graham's door was already open. He stood behind his desk, shirt sleeves rolled up, reviewing a legal folder. A second coffee sat on the edge of the table, still steaming. Without preamble, he gestured to the chair across from him. Let's see it. Claire opened her laptop and connected it to the screen on the far wall. The first slide appeared clean white background, navy lettering, a quiet kind of authority. She began to walk him through it. No small talk, no hesitation, just clarity. This version includes the September 3rd compliance update, she said, pointing to the revised zoning overlays. I've also added a phased rollout option in case the funding is staggered over quarters. Graham nodded, eyes on the data, risk mitigation, slide 8. She clicked forward. If the East Foundation hits groundwater earlier than expected, we can switch to steel reinforcements with minimal cost increase. It's already reflected in the budget forecast. Suppliers, 2 domestic, 1 Canadian, all 3 have delivered on municipal projects in the last 18 months. His eyebrows lifted impressed, but not performative. You stayed up all night doing this? He asked. Claire gave a small shrug. I used to do this every week. There was no pride in her tone. Just fact. He leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. You're not just saving this project. You're rebuilding it stronger than it ever was. Claire sat still. I'm not sure the council will believe me anymore, he said after a moment, but they might believe you. There was no bitterness in his voice, no deflection, only honesty. She looked at him, really looked, not as her boss, not as the man who had once dismissed her with barely a glance, but as someone capable of recognizing his own blind spots, of shifting. I'm not here to replace you, Graham, she said gently, just to help the plan succeed. He nodded, slow and deliberate. Then let's go. Succeed together. At 8:00 a.m. They walked into the city council chamber, side by side. No one whispered, no one stared, but Claire could feel the shift. This time, she didn't sit in the back. She stood at the front table, laptop ready, proposal binder in hand, Graham beside her, not leading the way, but standing with her, as equals. And when the meeting began, when the questions started, Claire was ready. She didn't need a title. She had earned her place. When they entered the boardroom, the energy shifted. 2 voices, 1 vision. The room was already full polished shoes tapping lightly on hardwood, chairs creaking as council members settled in, papers rustling with purpose. But when Claire and Graham stepped through the glass doors, a subtle current moved through the air, like the collective inhale before an overture begins. Claire felt it in the way heads turned, not sharply, not with surprise, but with curiosity. She was no longer the silent woman taking notes in the back corner, no longer the hand that quietly delivered agendas and coffee. Today, she stood shoulder to shoulder with the CEO, holding her own binder, wearing the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place. Graham, for his part, looked composed, crisp suit, no tie, hands relaxed at his sides. But there was a softness in his posture Claire hadn't seen before. Something more open, less armored. They took their places at the front table, the presentation already loaded onto the screen behind them. A small microphone clicked on, and then they began. Graham opened with a clear, steady tone. Thank you all for making time this morning. I want to start not with numbers, but with vision. He paused, letting the silence settle. Whitaker and Rowe has always believed that infrastructure is more than concrete and steel. It's about shaping how communities live, move, and thrive. And with this proposal, we're not just building a structure, we're building trust, longevity, resilience. Claire glanced at him briefly, sensing the rhythm he was setting. She knew exactly when to step in. As he transitioned into the broader strategy projected growth, partnerships, future expansions, Claire moved her hand slowly across the trackpad and advanced the slide. Then she spoke. Let's take a closer look at how that vision comes to life, beginning with the structural adaptations we've made in response to the updated zoning regulations as of September. Her voice was calm, clear, not theatrical, but measured. She didn't rush. She didn't fill space with unnecessary words. Each sentence carried intention. She walked the board through the revised engineering specs, annotated diagrams, alternate load-bearing configurations, energy efficiency projections, all grounded in the kind of specificity that made the room lean forward, when one of the members, a tall woman in a navy blazer, interrupted with a question about long-term maintenance costs. Claire didn't even blink. Slide 14, she replied. We've projected a 15% cost reduction over 10 years due to material upgrades and seasonal adaptation features. We've also included preventive maintenance incentives in the contractor bid. The woman nodded slowly, lips pursed in approval. Then Graham picked up again, speaking to the broader community impact jobs created, small business contracts, school district reinvestments. Claire followed by breaking down the labor cost curve, comparing regional benchmarks. Her charts were simple but powerful, no fluff, just clarity. They moved like dancers, each knowing when to lead, when to follow, when to pause so the other could breathe, when to reinforce, when to carry. About 40 minutes in, Councilman Park, a reserved man known for his brutal questions, shifted in his seat. Claire had just finished walking through the three-phase implementation timeline and was now explaining the projected return on investment over the first 18 months post-construction. We're estimating a 3.2x return based on commercial lease interest already expressed by local vendors, she said. Those letters of intent are included in Appendix D. Park adjusted his glasses and flipped through the binder. Then he nodded, not once, but several times. Claire saw it. So did Graham. And then came the moment that neither of them could have planned for, the one that would linger long after the slides had been closed. Catherine Rowe cleared her throat. Seated at the far end of the table, Catherine was one of the company's original founders, semi-retired, sharp as ever, and famously unmoved by performance. She rarely spoke unless she had something worth carving into stone. Now, she set her pen down and looked squarely at Graham. Mr. Whitaker, she said, her voice smooth but firm. I hope you realize what you have in front of you. The room paused. Graham held her gaze for a moment, then glanced sideways at Claire, a glance filled with something warmer than pride, deeper than professional regard, recognition, gratitude, and maybe something else he hadn't quite named yet. Catherine turned her attention to Claire. You have a talent not just for data, she said, but for making people listen to it. Claire inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the compliment without letting it swell. But inside, she felt something shift, as if a long-locked part of herself had finally been invited back into the room. The meeting continued, but there was a different air now. The questions became more engaged, the responses more collaborative. No longer was Claire fielding inquiries as a stand-in for Graham. She was being addressed, directly respected as the mind behind the models, not just the mouth that spoke them. At one point, a junior council member leaned in and asked, would it be possible to have your implementation phases shared with our urban planning team for benchmarking? Claire smiled. I've already formatted them for that purpose. I'll forward the files right after this. Graham didn't interrupt. He didn't jump in to answer. He didn't correct or redirect. He simply sat beside her, attentive, engaged, and, most importantly, quiet when it mattered. It was perhaps the most powerful thing he had done all day. As the meeting drew to a close, the council called for a short recess before final deliberations. A few members stood, stretching legs, refilling coffee, papers shuffled. Soft murmurs filled the room. Claire exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. Graham leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice. "You carried that," he said, "from start to finish." Claire turned to him, brows raised slightly. "We both did." He smiled, not wide, not showy, but real. "I used to think the hardest part of leadership was protecting the vision," he said, "but maybe it's knowing when to share it." Claire looked at him, really looked, and in that moment, between fluorescent lights and lukewarm coffee, with the sound of muted footsteps behind them and the weight of decisions just ahead, she realized they had crossed a line, not one drawn in ink or policy, but something quieter. They weren't employer and employee anymore. They were co-architects of a project, of something more. Success didn't feel like a trophy. It felt like finally being seen. As the final votes were counted and the decision made, Claire didn't look around the room for approval. She didn't need the nods, the handshakes, or the polite applause that followed. She needed only the stillness inside her, the quiet voice that said, "You did it. You mattered. The proposal was approved, unanimously, without amendments, slowly." Members of the city council filed out, exchanging quiet congratulations. Some offered quick smiles. Others extended hands toward Graham or gave Claire a respectful nod. Even the more reserved ones, like Councilman Park, paused before leaving not to speak, but simply to meet Claire's gaze with the weight of acknowledgement. And then the room was quiet again. Claire stood by the long table, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the other still clutching her notes, though she no longer needed them. Her breath had found its natural rhythm again. The pulse in her ears had calmed. Behind her, the large projection screen faded to black. Across the room, Graham remained at the head of the table, hands folded, his expression unreadable at first, not cold, not impersonal, just still. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the briskness it once did in morning briefings or terse replies. It was quieter now, steadier. "You know," he said, "I've presented in that room a dozen times, but I've never seen them listen the way they listen to you." Claire turned, tilting her head slightly. "They listened because what I said mattered." "Yes," he agreed. "And because of how you said it." She didn't smile, not yet. There was something sacred about the silence in that moment, like a space neither of them wanted to fill too quickly. The room still held the echo of what had just happened. Neither of them wanted to overwrite it. After a pause, Graham stood and slowly walked to her side of the table. He didn't bring papers, no laptop, no coffee, just his presence human, real, without title. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said, "but today made it very clear." He looked at her fully. "Claire, I'd like to offer you a new position. Not assistant, not temporary, not in anyone's shadow." She stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I want you to lead our strategic analysis division, director level, build the team from scratch, report directly to me, full autonomy, full compensation package, equity options too." Her fingers curled slightly around the edges of her notes, not from surprise but from the weight of possibility. "You deserve a seat at the table," he said simply, "and not just this one." The offer hung in the air, not flashy, not dramatic, but powerful in its steadiness. Claire didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked down at the table where the council members had sat just minutes ago. She imagined her mother's voice strong, before the memory loss had started telling her to trust her instincts. Then softly, carefully, she replied, "It's not just about the title." "I know," Graham said. "That's why I'm offering more than a title." She inhaled slowly, then spoke the words that had been with her for months. "My mother has Alzheimer's. It's early, but it's progressing. I visit her 4 times a week sometimes during the workday. She has good days and not so good ones. I need 2 days a week where I can work from home, maybe even from the care center, and flexibility when emergencies come up." Her voice didn't waver, but there was vulnerability in every word. "I can give you everything I have," she continued. "My brain, my skills, my commitment, but I can't give you my mother's time. That's not something I'm willing to miss." She waited for the hesitation, waited for the conditions, the softening of the offer. But Graham didn't blink. "Then we'll structure it that way," he said without pause. "Remote access, flexible hours, whatever you need. You don't have to choose between showing up for your mother and showing up here." Claire looked at him, startled not by the offer, but by the ease in his response. No defensiveness, no bargaining, just acceptance. "She used to tell me," Claire whispered, more to herself than to him, that success wasn't climbing a ladder. It was holding steady when the wind blew hardest. Graham smiled, not broadly, but with something genuine in his eyes. "Sounds like she raised you well." "She did," Claire replied. "Still does, in the ways that matter." The air between them softened. The boardroom, once so formal and filled with tension, now felt oddly warm, like a place where things began, not just ended. Claire looked down at the offer he had slid across the table, the terms written out, the role defined, the signature line waiting. "I'll need to review this," she said. "Of course," Graham answered. "Take your time." But then she looked up and added, almost as an afterthought, "But I think I already know." He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. Because in her eyes, he could see something rising, not just ambition, but ownership. Not gratitude, but clarity. Not permission, but choice. As Claire walked toward the windows, sunlight broke faintly through the clouds, a Chicago morning finally finding its light. She stood there a moment, her reflection cast in the glass, layered over the city she had once felt lost in. This time, she saw herself not as an assistant, not as someone surviving quietly behind the scenes, but as someone who had stepped forward, fully, finally, behind her. Graham gathered his things quietly, but before he left the room, he turned back. "You know," he said, "this is only the beginning." Claire smiled, eyes still on the skyline. "I know," and for the first time, she believed it. He used to walk past her without a word. Now, he waits for her to speak first. It had been a week, 7 days since the meeting that changed the way people looked at Claire Bennett, and perhaps, more importantly, how she looked at herself. She arrived at the office on Monday not earlier than usual, not with new clothes or a new walk. The building hadn't changed. The light in the lobby was still cold and polished. The elevator still paused with a faint mechanical sigh before opening on the 24th floor. But something was different, subtle, but sure. When Claire stepped off the elevator, Karen at reception smiled and said, "Morning, Claire," not, "Hey," not, "Good morning, ma'am," just Claire, as if her name finally belonged here. She answered with a nod, as always, still herself, still quiet, but she did smile back. In the past, she would have walked straight to the corner desk, started her day by prepping someone else's agenda. Now, her new office smaller than Graham's, but with its own window held her own laptop, her own whiteboard, and her own chair that no one else had ever sat in. She didn't redecorate, she didn't need to, but she did hang one small photo of her mother, taken 2 years before the diagnosis, laughing in a sun hat at a picnic. That was enough. The changes at work weren't dramatic. Graham didn't deliver speeches in the hallway or send out mass emails announcing her promotion. No confetti, no ceremony. Instead, there were small signs. In morning meetings, he paused before speaking, giving Claire the space to lead. In front of others, he asked her opinion first, not to be polite, but because he wanted her answer before it became anyone else's echo. When she spoke, others listened, not with surprise, but with expectation. And somehow, that was even better. On Thursday, just after 12:15 p.m., Graham appeared at her doorway, no assistant, no agenda in hand. "You eaten?" he asked. Claire looked up from a spreadsheet. Not yet. He held up 2 paper bags from the cafe downstairs, the kind with grease stains and the smell of roasted turkey seeping through the folds. "They messed up my order. Made 2. She raised an eyebrow. Convenient. He smiled, setting one bag on her desk. or generous. They ate in her office, no laptops, no meeting notes. For a while, there was only the sound of crinkled wrappers and muted city noise through the windows. He took a sip of iced tea, looked over at her, not with the distant glaze of a man already thinking 3 meetings ahead, but with something more. Open? You know, he said slowly. I keep wondering. Claire waited. If things had been different, if we'd met under other circumstances, do you think this would have gone another way? She let the question settle. It didn't come with pressure, just curiosity. The kind that only rises when the urgency fades and the connection begins. She didn't rush to answer. Instead, she folded the edges of her sandwich wrapper, careful, methodical. Maybe, she said, maybe we would have missed each other. He tilted his head. I think we met exactly when we were supposed to, she added. Graham leaned back in the chair, the corner of his mouth curving upward. That's either very wise or very convenient. Claire looked out the window. Maybe both. The afternoon passed in quiet productivity. Claire returned emails, adjusted project milestones, reviewed the legal compliance notes Rachel had flagged. At one point, she glanced at the clock and realized she still had time. Time that used to be stolen. Now. It was structured around what mattered most. She packed up quietly, tucked a folder into her bag, and stepped into the fading light of a Chicago evening. The wind had picked up. Leaves gathered at the corners of sidewalks, dancing a little before settling. Claire walked 3 blocks to the Red Line, caught the train north, and made her way to the assisted living center just before visiting hours slowed for the night shift. She signed in. The nurse at the front desk greeted her by name. Down the hallway, familiar now, in that weary, comforting way, she found her mother seated by the window in the common room. The chair was the same. The blanket was the same. The way her hands rested in her lap, quiet, folded hadn't changed, but her mother's eyes, they wandered tonight, searching the room, then pausing at a spot in the distance that held no meaning. Claire approached slowly, knelt beside the chair. Hi, Mom, she said, her voice soft. Her mother turned. There was no spark of recognition, no flicker of memory, just the slow blink of someone unmoored from the map of her own life. Claire used to cry after visits like this, used to sit in her car outside, gripping the wheel until her breath came back. But tonight, she didn't cry. She took her mother's hand, warm and dry, and held it gently. Outside, the sky turned indigo. Inside. Claire hummed a tune one her mother used to sing while cooking on Sundays. It filled the space, soft and unhurried. Her mother's eyes closed. For a moment, her fingers curled slightly around Claire's. That was enough. The world hadn't shifted on its axis, but something had realigned inside her, and maybe, just maybe, inside him too. Being seen wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a new one. Claire Bennett stepped onto the stage with a kind of stillness that only comes after a long storm. The lights above were warm, not harsh. The carpet beneath her heels muffled the sound of her steps. A small mercy, she thought. The conference room was filled to capacity, every chair occupied, the air thick with expectation. Urban Planning and Future Cities, that was the name of the session. A fancy title for a room full of people who often talked more than they listened. But not today. Today, they would listen to her, not because of her title, or the size of her office, or the man who introduced her, but because she had something worth saying. And this time, she wasn't whispering. Graham Whitaker had taken the podium first. His voice, as always, was steady, measured, controlled. He introduced Claire with the formality of a CEO, her new role, her recent contributions, her background in urban economic analysis. But something changed in his tone near the end. She's not just a colleague, he said. She's the reason we're standing here with a winning proposal. She saw what I didn't and had the courage to say it. He didn't overstate it, but he didn't underplay it either. He stepped back as Claire walked forward, eyes meeting hers briefly, no nod, no smile, just that quiet space between them that had grown over the last few weeks. Like a hallway they were still walking down together. She turned to face the crowd. No notes, just a hand resting lightly on the podium, her breath steady. "I didn't come here today to impress you," she began, voice low but clear. "I came to tell you the truth. Silence, not the awkward kind, the listening kind. There was a time I thought success meant never making mistakes. That being in control was the same as being strong. I worked in finance, I led teams, I had a corner office and a schedule booked 3 months in advance." A pause, a breath. "And then my mother got sick. She didn't need to go into the medical charts or the long hours spent in hospital rooms. She just let the words fall where they may. I gave it all up, not because I stopped being who I was, but because I had to become someone else for a while. I took a job that let me disappear into routine. It paid the bills. It gave me insurance. But it didn't ask for my voice." She looked out at them, saw heads nodding, older women, middle-aged men, a younger intern in the second row gripping her notepad. "And for a while, I let that be enough." Another pause. Until one day, it wasn't. She walked them through the project briefly, the infrastructure plan, the mistake in the early data, the revised proposal that won the vote, not in numbers or charts, but in language people understood. "I didn't fix the plan because it was my job," she said. "I did it because I cared, and because I couldn't stay quiet anymore." There were no theatrics in her voice, just the steady calm of someone who had stood in a corner long enough to learn exactly what mattered. When she finished, the room was still. Then, slowly, applause began, not thunderous, but sincere. Graham was the first to stand. Claire stepped down from the stage, heart beating not from fear, but from something gentler. Pride, perhaps, or simply peace. Later. As the room emptied, Graham found her standing near the tall windows that looked out over the city. The early evening sun caught the glass of nearby buildings, casting golden streaks across the carpet. He stood beside her without speaking. They watched the streets below, people moving, cars humming, the rhythm of life resuming. "You were good," he said finally. Claire didn't answer right away. "You made me sound more important than I am," she said, her tone light. He glanced at her. "I undersold you." They stood quietly, the air between them less formal than it had ever been, but not heavy. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. "I used to think leadership meant being the loudest voice," he said after a while. "Now I think it's knowing when to listen." Claire looked at him. "I used to think being invisible was safer," she said softly, "but I'm learning that being seen, really seen, can be worth the risk." He nodded, his gaze steady. "It is." They didn't speak of futures, not in the way young people do. No declarations, no what-ifs painted across the skyline. Just a question, simple and without weight. "Do you want to grab a coffee?" Graham asked, voice low. Claire smiled. She didn't rush her answer. "I'd like that." And so, they walked not into a sunset, not toward any grand conclusion, but simply into the city, side by side. There were no headlines the next morning. No one wrote articles about the woman who once fetched coffee and now directed strategy. But inside her, something had shifted for good. She wasn't standing in someone else's shadow anymore. She wasn't a footnote. She was part of the story. And in the quiet glow of a city still turning, Claire Bennett finally felt what she hadn't dared to hope for. Not just recognition, but belonging, sometimes. The most powerful thing we can do is to step forward even when no one is watching. Claire's journey reminds us that staying silent for too long can make us forget the sound of our own voice. It's easy, especially as we get older, to let the world pass by, to settle into the background, and convince ourselves that being useful is enough, even if we're not truly seen. But every life holds value, every voice carries truth, and there are moments when choosing to speak to, share what we know, to stand for what we believe can change not just a room, but a life. This isn't just a story about a job or a promotion. It's a reminder that dignity is not tied to a title, that no matter your age or role, it's never too late to reclaim your worth, to be heard, and to be seen. So if you've been quiet for too long, Maybe today is the day to speak, not loudly, just truthfully, and that is more than enough. Thank you for spending your time with us and letting this story into your heart. If it touched you, even just a little, we'd be so grateful if you could give it a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more soulful stories like this. Your support helps keep these quiet but powerful voices alive. Until next time, take care, and never forget the strength in your story.